Meet Maria Rodriguez, a 25-year-old medical doctor in Caracas, Venezuela in 1998. She just finished her residency at Hospital Universitario de Caracas, one of the best medical facilities in Latin America, fully stocked with modern equipment and imported medicines. Her monthly salary is 800,000 bolivars, which equals about $2,000 USD, a respectable middle-class income that lets her rent a nice apartment in the Altamira neighborhood and save money for a down payment on a house. Venezuela in 1998 is an immigration magnet where people from all over Latin America and Europe come to find work. Because the country has the highest GDP per capita in the entire region, at $4,500, making it wealthier than Mexico, wealthier than Brazil, wealthier than Chile. Meet Carlos Mendoza, a 32-year-old petroleum engineer working for PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, the state-owned oil company in Maracaibo. He earns 1.2 million bolivars monthly, about $3,000 USD. PDVSA in 1998 is professionally run like a real business with minimal government interference. It employs the best engineers in Latin America and produces 3.2 million barrels of oil per day from the world's largest proven oil reserves at 302 billion barrels. Carlos and his wife just bought their first house and are expecting their first child. Venezuela's future looks bright. Meet Rosa Fernandez, a 50-year-old school teacher in Valencia, earning 600,000 bolivars, about $1,500 monthly. She's been teaching for 25 years and has a good pension plan. Her students have textbooks, the school has electricity and running water. Everything works. And meet Luis Gomez, an 18-year-old recent high school graduate from a working-class family in Petare, Caracas's largest barrio. He just got accepted to Universidad Central de C. Venezuela to study engineering. Tuition is free, and while his family isn't rich, the supermarkets are stocked with affordable food. His neighborhood has electricity. His mother works as a seamstress and earns enough to support the family. Venezuela during the mid-20th century was literally the model that other Latin American countries aspired to follow, with a competitive, transparent, democratic system that managed oil wealth responsibly. But then in December 1998, something catastrophic happens. A former military officer named Hugo Chavez, who attempted a failed coup d'etat against democratically elected President Carlos Andrés Pérez just 6 years earlier in February 1992, spending 2 years in prison before being pardoned, wins the presidential election by promising the working class and minorities that he'll redistribute the nation's oil wealth and create what he calls 21st century socialism, or the Bolivarian Revolution, named after Simón Bolívar, the Venezuelan independence hero. Chavez is charismatic. He wears a red beret. He goes on TV for hours talking directly to poor Venezuelans, telling them that the rich have stolen from them, that the oil wealth belongs to the people, that he will take it back. And when Chavez takes office in February 1999, what happens next over the following 27 years from 1999 to 2026 is one of the most complete economic collapses ever recorded in peacetime, rivaling only countries that experienced civil wars like Iraq, Lebanon, and Liberia, or the former Soviet republics after the USSR disintegrated. Venezuela's GDP will fall by 75% between 2013 and 2021, making it the fifth largest economic contraction in modern history. Living standards will plummet 74% in a single decade. 7.7 million people, 22.5% of the entire population, will flee the country, creating the largest refugee crisis in Latin American history. Hyperinflation will reach 130,000% in 2018, with the Bolivar losing 99.999% of its value-making. Maria's 800,000 Bolivar salary worthless, making Carlos's savings evaporate, making Rosa's pension become worth less than a loaf of bread. And the first catastrophic policy that Chavez implements when he takes power in 1999 is to start nationalizing and expropriating private companies across every sector of the economy. In 2001, Chavez announces on his weekly TV show, Allo Presidente, which airs for hours every Sunday, that he's implementing the land law allowing the government to seize idle farmland. He begins confiscating agricultural land, claiming he's taking from rich landowners to give to poor workers, returning to the people what belongs to the people, as he says, live on camera, with cameras following armed government officials showing up at farms and ranches. From 1999 to 2016, the Chavez regime seizes more than 6 million hectares of land from their rightful owners, often without any compensation, just soldiers arriving with papers and forcing families who've owned land for generations to leave. And exactly as economic theory predicts when you destroy private property rights and replace professional management with political cronies who know nothing about farming food. Production collapses. Venezuela's agricultural output falls 75% over 2 decades, while the population increases 33%. The country that used to feed itself now has to import food, but the government doesn't have the foreign currency to pay for imports because Chavez has also implemented currency controls. But agriculture is just the beginning of the nationalization spree. By 2010, Chavez has nationalized or expropriated more than 200 private companies across banking, cement, steel, retail, telecommunications, electricity, water, oil services, and every other crucial sector. In May 2008, Chavez nationalizes the cement industry on live TV, announcing that he's seizing plants owned by Mexico's Cemex, Switzerland's Holcim, and France's Lafarge cement production, which was meeting domestic demand. Immediately starts falling after nationalization, dropping 60% within 5 years. By 2013, Venezuela, which used to export cement, now has to import cement from Colombia because the nationalized cement plants are run by political appointees who don't know how to manage industrial facilities. In 2007, Chavez nationalizes CanTV, the country's largest telephone company, by buying out Verizon Communications' 28.5% share for $572 million, and then uses the company for political censorship, blocking opposition websites during protests. He nationalizes the nation's largest private electricity producer in 2007, paying AES Corp. $740 million for its 82% share. And after nationalization, Venezuela's electrical grid, which used to be reliable, becomes plagued with frequent blackouts. On September 3, 2013, one of the largest blackouts in Venezuelan history occurs when 70% of the country loses power, with 14 of Venezuela's 23 states reporting no electricity for most of the day, hospitals operating on backup generators, supermarkets losing refrigerated food, traffic lights out causing chaos. Maria, the doctor, sees the hospital where she works start having medicine shortages in the early 2000s. First, it's specialized drugs, then common antibiotics, then basic supplies. Carlos, the petroleum engineer at PDVSA, watches in horror as something even more catastrophic unfolds. In December 2002, after Chavez has been in power for nearly 4 years and has been increasingly interfering with PDVSA operations, trying to use the company as his personal piggy bank to fund social programs, PDVSA workers go on strike. The strike is partly political protesting Chavez's authoritarian tendencies, but it's also professional. The engineers and managers understand that Chavez is destroying the company's technical capacity. The strike lasts from December 2002 into early 2003, and Chavez's response is brutal and catastrophic for Venezuela's future. In February 2003, Chavez fires approximately 18,000 PDVSA employees in one massive purge, nearly 40% of the entire workforce, including engineers like Carlos, who has spent 10 years learning Venezuela's oil fields, including geologists who know where the oil reserves are, including senior managers who understand the complex logistics of oil production, refining, and export. These aren't political hacks. These are the technical experts who actually know how to run one of the world's largest oil companies. The institutional knowledge that took decades to build. Carlos receives his termination notice in March 2003. He's 37 years old with a decade of experience in petroleum engineering and a specialized skill set that's virtually useless outside the oil industry. He has a wife, a young child, and a mortgage, and suddenly he has no job. Chavez replaces the fired PDVSA workers with Chavistas, political loyalists from the Bolivarian movement, who have zero technical expertise in petroleum engineering. Many of them don't have university degrees. Some barely finished high school, but they're loyal to Chavez, and that's what matters. And the result on oil production is catastrophic and immediate. Production falls from 3.2 million barrels per day in 1998 before Chavez to 2.95 million barrels per day in 2007 to 2.3 million barrels per day by 2014. Even though global oil prices are sky high, oil fields that used to produce high-quality light crude are abandoned because there's no investment, no maintenance, no exploration. The people running PDVSA don't understand that oil fields require constant reinvestment, constant technological upgrades, constant geological surveys. Venezuela becomes increasingly dependent on heavy crude from the Orinoco Basin, which is too dense and sulfurous to transport through pipelines without blending it with lighter crude. So incredibly, Venezuela, which has the world's largest oil reserves, starts having to import light crude oil from other countries just to blend it with its own heavy crude to be able to export anything. It's like owning a gold mine but not knowing how to extract gold, so you have to buy gold from someone else to mix with your gold just to sell it absurd. But that's what happens when you fire all your technical experts and replace them with political loyalists. Carlos can't find work in Venezuela because PDVSA was the main employer for petroleum engineers, and they've blacklisted strike participants. He eventually finds work in 2005 at a private oil services company, but earning half his PDVSA salary. And through all of this, from 1999 to the early 2010s, Chavez is spending unprecedented amounts of money because oil prices are high oil, which sold for about $10 per barrel in 1999, rises to $30 by 2003 to $50 by 2005 to over $100 per barrel from 2008 to 2014 instead of saving. This windfall in a sovereign wealth fund like Norway did, instead of using it to diversify the economy, instead of building up reserves for the inevitable price crash, Chavez spends every dollar immediately on populist programs. Public expenditure increases from 28% of GDP in 1998 to more than 40% by 2012. Chavez creates the Bolivarian missions, which are social programs aimed at providing free healthcare, free education, subsidized food, government-built housing. Misión Barrio Adentro brings Cuban doctors to poor neighborhoods. Misión Robinson claims to eliminate illiteracy. Misión Mercal provides subsidized food. And yes, poverty rates do initially fall from about 49% in 1999 to 23.9% by 2012, according to official statistics. But these gains are built entirely on consumption, funded by high oil prices, not on productivity, not on creating real jobs, not on building industries, not on anything sustainable. It's like a family that gets a huge raise, and instead of saving for retirement or investing in education, they max out credit cards, buying consumer goods, and then the raise ends and they're bankrupt. No buffers are built, no reserves are accumulated, no economic diversification happens. Venezuela becomes even more dependent on oil revenues, increasing from 80% oil dependency in 1999 to 95% dependency by 2012. Oil revenue replaces taxation as the state's primary funding source, which erodes democratic accountability because politicians don't need to tax citizens and answer to voters. They have oil money, they answer to whoever controls the oil, and Chavez implements another devastating policy in 2003, which is price controls. He announces that basic goods like food cooking, oil, rice, pasta, milk will have government-mandated maximum prices, supposedly to help the poor afford necessities. Rosa, the school teacher, initially thinks this is wonderful because her salary hasn't kept up with inflation. So price controls seem like they'll help her, but price controls never work. In the history of economics, they always create shortages every single time because at artificially low prices more people want to buy, but private factories and farms can't profit at the government-mandated price, so they reduce or halt production. By 2005, supermarkets in Venezuela start experiencing shortages of milk, of chicken, of beef, of cooking oil. People start lining up at 4 a.m. outside supermarkets hoping to get ration goods when trucks arrive. By 2010, these lines are hours long. Rosa spends her Saturdays standing in line for 3 hours to maybe get chicken and rice. Supermarket employees and people with government connections get first access to scarce goods, while ordinary citizens go hungry despite having money in their pockets. They can't buy food because there's no food to buy. The government blames economic war by the opposition and business owners supposedly hoarding goods. But the reality is simple price controls make production unprofitable, so production stops. Chavez also implements foreign currency controls in 2003 through CADIV, the Commission for the Administration of Currency Exchange. The government sets an official exchange rate between the bolivar and the US dollar. In 2003, the official rate might be 1,920 bolivars per dollar, but on the black market, the rate might be 3,000 bolivars per dollar because everyone knows the bolivar is overvalued. By 2010, the official rate is 4.3 bolivars per dollar, but the black market rate is 8 bolivars per dollar. By 2013, when Chavez dies, the gap is enormous. Official rate 6.3, black market rate 25. Currency controls are supposedly to prevent capital flight and preserve foreign exchange reserves, but they do the exact opposite. They create massive corruption. Government officials who have access to dollars at the official rate can buy them cheap and resell them on the black market for instant 400% profits. This is how the Bolivarian oligarchs make billions in corruption. Currency controls also strangle any business that needs to import raw materials or equipment, because getting dollars at the official rate requires government approval, which means bribing officials or having political connections. And through all of this from 1999 to 2013, Chavez is consolidating authoritarian power. In 2009, he eliminates presidential term limits through a referendum so he can rule indefinitely. He takes control of the Supreme Court, packing it with loyalists. He takes control of the CNE, the National Electoral Council, which runs elections. He takes control of the military by promoting loyal generals and firing anyone who questions him. He harasses, shuts down, or takes over independent media outlets. In 2007, he refuses to renew the broadcast license for RCTV, the oldest and most watched television network, because it criticized him. He uses Khedive currency controls as a weapon against critics. Newspapers that criticize the government suddenly can't get dollars to import newsprint and have to shut down. Opposition politicians face trumped-up corruption charges and are banned from running for office. When Chavez dies of cancer on March 5, 2013, at age 58, after 14 years in power, he leaves behind an economy that's already fragile and starting to crack, with shortages, with inflation around 20%, with oil production declining, with no savings despite high oil prices, with destroyed institutions, with no checks and balances. He bequeaths the presidency to his chosen successor, Nicolas Maduro, a former bus driver and union organizer who has even less competency to govern. Maduro lacks Chavez's charisma, lacks his political skills, lacks any understanding of economics, and the timing is catastrophic because just as Maduro takes power in April 2013, global oil prices, which had been over $100 per barrel, start falling. By mid-2014, oil crashes from $115 per barrel to below $50. By early 2016, oil is below $30 per barrel. For any normal country, this would be a recession. You tighten your belt, you cut spending, you make adjustments, you survive. For Venezuela, which has spent 15 years destroying its non-oil economy, which has wasted all the oil boom revenues, which has no savings, no reserves, no diversified economy, it becomes an apocalypse. Maduro's response to falling oil revenues is the stupidest possible response. He prints money, lots and lots of money, instead of cutting government spending, instead of eliminating the expensive Bolivarian missions, instead of stopping subsidies, instead of making any difficult reforms whatsoever. Maduro instructs the central bank of Venezuela to just print more bolívares to pay for everything, and this triggers hyperinflation that reaches levels seen only in Zimbabwe and Weimar Germany and Hungary after World War II. Inflation, which was about 20% in 2012, rises to 69% in 2014, making Venezuela the highest inflation rate in the world. Then it explodes 180% in 2015, 800% in 2016, 2,400% in 2017, 130,000% in 2018, over 1,000% in 2019, 1,000,000%. To put this in perspective, if you had 100 bolivars in your pocket in the morning, by evening, those 100 bolivars might only buy half of what they bought in the morning. If you got paid on Monday, by Friday, your salary was worth 30% less. Prices change so fast that shops stop putting price tags on items. They just write prices in marker and change them every few hours. The government keeps issuing new currency denominations, removing zeros. In 2008, Chavez creates the Bolivar Fuerte, the strong Bolivar, removing 3 zeros, so 1,000 old bolivars becomes 1 new bolivar. In August 2018, Maduro creates the Bolivar Soberano, the sovereign bolivar, removing 5 more zeros. So 100,000 Bolívares Fuertes becomes 1 Bolivar Soberano. In October 2021, Maduro creates the Bolivar Digital, removing 6 more zeros. In total, the Venezuelan currency has lost 14 zeros, which means that 100 trillion old bolivars from 2008 equals 1 Bolivar Digital. Today, the currency has lost 99.999999999% of its value. Maria the doctor, who was earning 800,000 believers monthly in 1998, equivalent to $2,000, sees her salary become completely worthless. By 2017, her monthly salary as a physician in a Caracas hospital is maybe 500,000 bolivares soberanos, which sounds like a lot until you realize that equals about $6 USD per month. At the black market rate, $6 per month for a medical doctor. She can't afford food, she can't afford rent, she can't afford anything. Rosa, the school teacher who had a comfortable middle-class life in 1998 with a decent salary and a pension plan, watches her life savings and her pension become worthless. In 2016, her monthly pension payment is technically 1.2 million believers, but that equals maybe $15 at the black market rate, barely enough to buy a few pounds of rice. Carlos, who lost his PDVSA job in 2003 and eventually found work at a private company, sees that company shut down in 2016 because it can't import necessary equipment due to currency controls at age 50. He can't find any work because the economy is collapsing. Luis, who was 18 in 1998 and started studying engineering at Universidad Central de Venezuela, watches his university fall apart. Professors stop coming to work because their salaries are worthless. $3 per month for a university professor, so they quit and flee the country. The university can't afford to maintain buildings or labs or buy books. Luis drops out in 2015 at age 35 with no degree and no prospects, and the human cost of hyperinflation is absolutely devastating. Real wages collapse by more than 90% by 2020. Venezuela's minimum wage is 400,000 bolivares monthly, which equals $1.20 USD per month at the market rate. A teacher or nurse or factory worker who used to earn a decent living now can't afford to buy basic food, and when people can't afford food, they start starving. Venezuela experiences a humanitarian catastrophe of malnutrition and hunger that the country hasn't seen since the 19th century. In 2016, a national survey finds that 3/4 of the Venezuelan population has lost weight involuntarily from inadequate nutrition, losing an average of 8.7 kilograms, about 19 pounds. A 2017 survey finds that 64% of the population has lost 11 kilograms, about 24 pounds. In 2016, 73% of Venezuelans report losing 9 kilo. This phenomenon becomes known internationally as the Maduro diet. People are literally wasting away from hunger in a country that sits on the world's largest oil reserves. Food insecurity, which affected less than 5% of Venezuela's population in 2008-2013, rises to almost 12% in 2015-2017, representing 3.7 million people. By 2018, 79% of Venezuelans say they are unable to afford food, at times one of the highest rates of food insecurity in the world. Reports emerge of people eating from garbage bins, of people hunting stray dogs and cats for food, of people sneaking into the Caracas Zoo at night to kill and butcher animals. 4 meat flamingos were killed and eaten. A horse was killed and butchered. This isn't isolated desperation. This is mass starvation. Rosa, the former teacher, now in her late 60s, survives only because her daughter, who fled to Chile in 2017, sends remittances. Money transfers, maybe $30 or $40 per month. Rosa eats 1 meal per day. She's lost 15 kilograms. She looks skeletal. Maria, the doctor, hasn't had enough food to eat regularly. Since 2016, she's lost 12 kilograms. She has constant headaches from malnutrition. The collapse of the food system is a direct result of nationalizing agriculture, imposing price controls, printing money, destroying the currency, and preventing imports through currency. Controls in the healthcare system collapses right alongside the food system. Venezuela's hospitals, which in 1998 were among the best in Latin America, become death traps. By 2017, Maria watches the hospital where she works run out of basic supplies: no gloves, no gauze, no antibiotics, no painkillers, no surgical equipment, operating rooms close because there's no anesthesia. Cancer patients can't get chemotherapy because the drugs aren't available. People with diabetes can't get insulin. People with HIV can't get antiretrovirals. In 2016, the Venezuelan government stops publishing health statistics, but NGOs and researchers gathered data showing catastrophic health collapse. Infant mortality surges in 2016. Deaths of children under age 1 increased by 30% in a single year. from approximately 11,582 deaths to 15,051 deaths. Maternal mortality doubles. Preventable diseases that were nearly eradicated return with a vengeance. Malaria cases increased from 36,000 in 2009 to over 400,000 in 2017, a tenfold increase. Diphtheria, which had been absent from Venezuela for decades, returns with outbreaks in 2016 to 2017, killing children who weren't vaccinated because vaccine supplies ran out. Measles outbreaks occur, tuberculosis spreads, dengue fever, yellow fever, and other tropical diseases surge. And critically, by 2019, an estimated 300,000 Venezuelans with cancer, diabetes, or HIV are at risk of dying because they haven't had access to necessary medications for more than a year. Venezuela becomes a public health catastrophe, and neighboring countries, Brazil, Colombia, Guyana, start seeing diseases like measles and malaria spreading across borders from Venezuelan refugees. Healthcare professionals flee the country by the thousands. Doctors, nurses, pharmacists seeking work abroad, where they can actually earn a living and practice medicine. Between 2012 and 2018, approximately 22,000 doctors leave Venezuela out of about 60,000 total. More than one-third of the medical profession emigrates. Rosa desperately needs medication for her diabetes and high blood pressure but can't get it. Pharmacies are empty. She hasn't had her medications for 3 years. Her health is deteriorating rapidly. And while all this is happening, the electrical grid increasingly fails. Venezuela's electricity infrastructure, which was nationalized in 2007, receives no maintenance because the state electricity company has no money and employs political loyalists, not engineers. Rolling blackouts become common. By 2016, some areas go without power for 8-12 hours daily. Then in March 2019, Venezuela experiences a series of massive blackouts starting on March 7th when the Guri Dam, the hydroelectric facility that provides about 80% of the country's electricity, suffers a catastrophic failure. Most of Venezuela loses power for nearly a week. The blackouts continue through late March with repeated failures. Maduro blames sabotage by the United States, but technical experts point to lack of maintenance, to trees growing into transmission lines, to equipment that hasn't been serviced in years. During the blackouts, water pumping stations fail because they need electricity to operate, leaving two-thirds of the population, approximately 20 million people, without water partially or completely. For days or weeks, hospitals can't operate without electricity. Intensive care, patients die when ventilators stop working. Surgical procedures are canceled. Food spoils in refrigerators and freezers. Supermarkets lose their inventory. Businesses shut down completely. The internet goes dark. Public transportation stops. It's a complete infrastructure collapse of a country that once had reliable electricity. Maria is working at the hospital during the March 2019 blackouts. Patients on life support die because backup generators run out of fuel, and the hospital can't get more fuel. She watches. People die from completely preventable causes, and there's nothing she can do. And perhaps the most visible manifestation of Venezuela's collapse is the refugee crisis. The mass exodus of Venezuelans fleeing their country. Starting around 2015, Venezuelans begin leaving in increasing numbers. Initially, it's professionals, doctors like Maria, engineers, teachers, people with marketable skills who can find work in Colombia, Peru, Chile, Brazil. But by 2017-2018, the exodus becomes a flood. Everyone is fleeing. Even the poor are walking across borders because staying in Venezuela means starvation. People walk for weeks carrying children, elderly parents, sometimes pregnant women crossing from Venezuela into Colombia on foot because they have no money for bus fare. They cross the Darien Gap, the dangerous jungle between Colombia and Panama, one of the most treacherous migration routes in the world, where people die from exhaustion, from drowning in rivers, from criminal violence, from robbery, rape, and murder. But they do it anyway because staying in Venezuela is worse, and the numbers are staggering. In 2014, fewer than 700,000 Venezuelans were living abroad. By 2017, approximately 2 million had left. By 2019, the UN estimates that 4 million had fled. By 2021, it's 5.6 million. By early 2024, it's 7.7 million people. Approximately 22.5% of Venezuela's entire population has left the country. 1 in 4 Venezuelans no longer lives in Venezuela. To put this in perspective, the Syrian refugee crisis, which dominated global news from 2015-2020, saw about 6.7 million Syrians flee over a decade of brutal civil war with barrel bombs, chemical weapons, and ISIS. Venezuela has produced more refugees in a shorter time period with no war, no invasion, no natural disaster. This is purely economic and political collapse. The majority of Venezuelan refugees, about 6.5 million, stay in Latin America and the Caribbean because they can't afford to go farther. Colombia alone hosts 2.9 million Venezuelan refugees, which is an enormous burden on a country that's not particularly wealthy itself. Peru has 1.5 million, Ecuador has over 500,000, Chile has nearly 500,000, Brazil has close to 400,000, Argentina has 170,000. These refugees face discrimination, xenophobia, lack of legal documentation, inability to work legally because many fled without passports. The Venezuelan government deliberately stopped issuing passports for years as a way to trap people in the country. Many Venezuelan women are forced into prostitution to survive to feed their children. Venezuelan children can't attend school in host countries without proper documentation. Families are separated when parents send children ahead, hoping to bring them back later, but never having money to reunite. Carlos, the former petroleum engineer, flees Venezuela with his wife and 2 children in 2018. They walk from Caracas to the Colombian border, a journey of several weeks, carrying backpacks with a few possessions. They cross illegally because Carlos couldn't get a passport. He left his house, his car, everything behind. In Colombia, Carlos works construction jobs, earning maybe $10 per day, working 12-hour shifts. It's physically exhausting, and he's 52 years old, but it's infinitely better than the $1 per month he could earn in Venezuela. His wife works as a street vendor selling empanadas. They rent a single room in a poor neighborhood of Bogota for their family of 4, but they're alive and they're eating. Maria flees Venezuela in 2018 at age 45 after spending 20 years as a physician, watching her profession become worthless. Watching her patients die from preventable diseases, watching her country collapse, she crosses into Colombia and works as a street vendor selling fruit, earning maybe $5 per day, which is more than she earned as a doctor in Venezuela. Her medical degree from Universidad Central de Venezuela is worthless in Colombia without Colombian certification, which she can't afford and doesn't have time to pursue. She needs to eat now. Luis, who dropped out of university, stays in Venezuela because he doesn't have money to leave or anywhere to go. By 2019, at age 39, he's unemployable with no degree, no skills, no prospects. He discovers that he can make more money playing RuneScape, a medieval fantasy video game, than working any real job in Venezuela. He spends 12 hours per day playing RuneScape, performing repetitive tasks to earn in-game gold, which he sells to players in the United States and Europe for real money. He makes maybe $3-4 per day from this, which is more than a nurse or teacher or factory worker earns in Venezuela, where minimum wage is $2 per month. This is what Venezuela has become, a country where playing video games pays better than professional work. And throughout all of this, from 2014 to 2021, Maduro denies that any crisis exists. He literally says on state television that reports of millions of Venezuelans emigrating are propaganda by the United States and the opposition. He claims that Venezuelans who leave the country regret it and end up cleaning toilets in Miami, implying that staying in Venezuela is better than being a janitor abroad. And angry Venezuelans respond online by saying, yes, we would rather clean toilets in Miami than starve in Venezuela, which tells you everything about how catastrophic conditions have become. Maduro blames everything on an economic war supposedly waged by the opposition and by the United States, and by business owners supposedly hoarding goods and sabotaging production. Yes, U.S. sanctions do play a role, especially after January 2019, when the Trump administration imposes secondary sanctions on PDVSA, cutting Venezuela off from formal global oil markets, forcing Venezuela to sell oil through black market intermediaries at steep discounts. These sanctions do significant economic damage. No question, but the collapse started years before serious sanctions. Oil production was already falling. Food shortages already existed. Hyperinflation already started before any meaningful sanctions. You cannot blame sanctions for the decision to fire 18,000 PDVSA engineers in 2003. That was Chavez's choice. You cannot blame sanctions for nationalizing 1-200 private companies. That was Chavez and Maduro's choice. You cannot blame external factors for imposing price controls that created shortages that was Chavez's choice. You cannot blame anyone else for printing money to finance unsustainable spending that was Maduro's choice. Every single policy that destroyed Venezuela was a domestic policy decision made by Venezuelan leaders, and by 2021, Venezuela has reached peak catastrophe. 95% of the population is living in poverty based on income, according to the National Survey of Living Conditions in COVI, out of which 77% live in extreme poverty, unable to afford a basic food basket. Venezuela, which had relatively low inequality in the 1990s, now has the highest inequality in the Americas. The Bolivarian oligarchs who are connected to the regime have gotten extraordinarily rich through corruption, controlling access to dollars, controlling import licenses, controlling food distribution while everyone else has gotten desperately poor. The richest 10% of Venezuelans control 61% of the nation's wealth, up from 30% before the crisis, while the poorest 20% have only 1.4% of wealth, down from 3.4%. It's grotesque inequality where regime insiders live in luxury, driving imported cars, eating imported food, sending their children to schools abroad, while ordinary Venezuelans are starving. And starting around 2019-2020, Maduro quietly abandoned some of Chavez's most destructive socialist policies, not because he's had an ideological awakening, not because he believes they were wrong, but because the economy has collapsed so completely that he has no choice. It's either reform slightly or face complete state failure. Price controls are quietly relaxed in many sectors, especially for non-essential goods. Currency controls are loosened. People are allowed to use U.S. dollars for transactions. Dollarization spreads throughout the economy by 2020. An estimated 50% of all transactions in Venezuela are in U.S. dollars because the bolivar is worthless. Upscale supermarkets and restaurants start operating almost exclusively in dollars, selling imported goods at prices that only the wealthy or those receiving remittances can afford. This creates a two-tier economy, a small dollar economy for the elite, and those with remittances, and a collapsed bolivar economy for everyone else. The government even allows some private businesses to operate without constant harassment because the state needs tax revenue. This creates a temporary stabilization. Inflation drops from the insane peak of 130,000% in 2018 and 1,000% in 2019 to 259.59% in 2020 to 686% in 2021 to 234% in 2022 to 190% in 2023. Those are still hyperinflation levels, but they're lower. Hyperinflation, GDP even grows slightly in 2022 for the first time in 8 years, growing about 8% after falling by 75% total. But this modest improvement means almost nothing for ordinary Venezuelans because the economy is starting from such a catastrophically low base. It's like saying someone who lost 90% of their body weight gained back 3%. That person is still dying. The damage is done. Oil production, which fell from 3.2 million barrels per day in 1998 to 2.3 million in 2014, has collapsed to barely 700,000 barrels per day. By 2020, a 78% decline. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves but produces less oil than Ecuador. Rebuilding PDVSA would require hundreds of billions in investment, decades of work and technical expertise that no longer exists in the country because all the engineers either were fired or fled. Millions have left and most aren't coming back. 7.7 million people, 1/4 of the population, is gone. The industrial base no longer exists. The 200 nationalized companies either closed or operate at minimal capacity. The human capital, all the doctors, engineers, teachers, accountants have emigrated, creating a brain drain that will take generations to reverse. Institutions have been completely hollowed out. The Supreme Court is a rubber stamp. The CNE Electoral Council is controlled by the regime. The military is thoroughly Chavista and involved in drug trafficking and corruption. There are no checks, no balances, no rule of law. Rosa died in 2021 at age 73 from complications of diabetes that could have been easily managed with proper medication and health care, but she hadn't had access to diabetes medication for 4 years. She died in her apartment in Valencia alone because her children had all fled to other countries. Maria is still in Colombia working as a street vendor. She's 51 years old. She'll never practice medicine again. Her 20 years of medical training are wasted. Carlos is working construction in Peru at age 56. His petroleum engineering degree is worthless. He sleeps in a tent in an informal settlement on the outskirts of Lima. Luis is still in Venezuela at age 44, still playing RuneScape to survive. Living with his elderly mother who can't flee. He has no future, no prospects, no life. And what makes Venezuela's collapse so instructive, so important as a case study, is that it was completely avoidable. Every single policy that caused this disaster was a choice. Chavez and Maduro chose to nationalize private industry instead of working with the private sector. They could have increased taxes, increased regulations, mandated profit sharing with workers, but they didn't need to seize companies and destroy them. They chose to purge PDVSA's technical staff in 2003. Instead of negotiating, they could have reached a compromise, kept the engineers, and maintained oil production. They chose to impose price controls instead of using targeted subsidies for the poor. They could have implemented direct cash transfers like Brazil's Bolsa Familia, which helps poor families without destroying markets. They chose to print money to finance spending instead of cutting spending or raising taxes. They could have tightened belts, made difficult choices, maintained fiscal discipline. They chose to spend every dollar of the oil boom from 2003-2014. Instead of saving, they could have created a sovereign wealth fund like Norway's. They chose to centralize power, destroy democratic institutions, jail opposition leaders, shut down free media. Instead of maintaining democracy, they chose ideology over competence. At every single decision point, they chose loyalty over expertise. They chose revolutionary rhetoric over pragmatic policy. And the alternative timeline, the one where Venezuela makes better choices, isn't fantasy. It's completely achievable. You can see it in other oil-rich countries. Imagine Venezuela in 1999 when Hugo Chavez takes power, except instead of following the Cuban socialist model or the Soviet model, he looks at Norway. Norway in the 1970s discovered massive oil reserves in the North Sea. It could have fallen into the same trap as Venezuela of spending all the oil money immediately. Instead, Norway did something brilliant. It created the Government Pension Fund Global in 1990, a sovereign wealth fund that saves oil revenues for future generations. Norway mandates that all state revenues from oil and gas beyond what's needed for the state budget go into this fund. The fund can only invest in foreign assets, not Norwegian assets, which prevents Dutch disease where oil wealth inflates the domestic economy and kills other industries. The fund is managed by Norges Bank Investment Management, which operates independently from political pressure. Professional investment managers, not politicians, decide where to invest. By 2024, Norway's sovereign wealth fund has over $1.6 trillion in assets, making it the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. Norway's population is only 5.5 million people, so that's nearly $300,000 per Norwegian citizen in saved wealth. And critically, when oil prices crash or when Norway faces economic difficulties, the country can draw on this enormous financial cushion. So imagine in this alternative timeline, Venezuela in 2000 creates the Venezuelan Sovereign Wealth Fund, modeled explicitly on Norway's model. The Venezuelan constitution is amended in 2000 during the Chavez presidency to mandate that 40% of all oil revenues when oil prices are above $40 per barrel must be deposited into this sovereign wealth fund. The fund can only be invested in foreign assets, global stock markets, global bonds, international real estate infrastructure, projects outside Venezuela. The fund is managed by an independent board of professional investment managers, insulated from political pressure, appointed for long fixed terms and removable only for cause, not for political reasons. And from 2000 to 2014, when oil prices are high, averaging over $80 per barrel and reaching 100 plus from 2008-2014, Venezuela deposits hundreds of billions into this sovereign wealth fund. Even with Chavez's expensive Bolivarian missions, even with increased social spending, 40% of oil revenues is still enormous amounts of money when you're producing 3 million barrels per day at $100 per barrel. By 2014, the Venezuelan Sovereign Wealth Fund has accumulated $400 billion in assets. This money is diversified, invested in Apple stock and Microsoft, in European government bonds, in Asian infrastructure, in global real estate, completely separated from Venezuela's oil-dependent economy. And critically, when oil prices crash in 2014-2016 from $100 to $30, Venezuela has this $400 billion cushion to draw on. Instead of facing immediate economic collapse, instead of having to print money and trigger hyperinflation, the government can draw maybe $20 to $30 billion per year from the sovereign wealth fund to smooth the transition while oil prices are low. This allows time to gradually adjust government spending to cut expensive programs to reform the economy without causing catastrophic collapse. There's no need to print money because there are savings to draw on inflation. Stays moderate, maybe 10-15% instead of 130,000%. The Bolivar doesn't collapse because the central bank can defend it using sovereign wealth fund resources. And in this alternative timeline, Chavez never nationalizes 1-200 private companies. Instead, he works with the private sector. Yes, he increases taxes on corporations, especially on oil companies. Yes, he mandates better labor conditions. Yes, he requires profit-sharing schemes where workers get dividends. Yes, he increases regulations to protect environment and labor rights, but he doesn't seize private property and destroy management. Agriculture remains private and productive. Venezuela continues feeding itself with Venezuelan-grown food. Cement companies remain private. They continue producing cement. They invest in modern equipment. Venezuela exports cement to neighbors. Electricity companies remain private, or if nationalized, are run professionally by engineers, not by political appointees. The electrical grid is maintained and expanded. There are no blackouts. Telecommunications companies remain private. They invest in expanding internet access and building 4G networks, and most critically in this alternative timeline, Chavez never purges PDVSA in 2003. When PDVSA workers strike in December 2002, Chavez negotiates, he reaches a compromise. Yes, he appoints some new board members. Yes, he increases oversight to prevent corruption. Yes, he mandates that a larger percentage of PDVSA profits go to social programs, but he doesn't fire 18,000 technical experts. Carlos, the petroleum engineer, keeps his job. PDVSA maintains its institutional knowledge, its engineering expertise, its geological surveys, and as a result, oil production in this alternative timeline not only maintains at 3.2 million barrels per day, but actually increases with new investments in technology and exploration in enhanced oil recovery techniques. By 2010, Venezuela is producing 3.5 million barrels per day. By 2020, it's producing 4 million barrels per day, more than it ever produced historically. PDVSA becomes a model national oil company. Comparable to Saudi Aramco or Norway's Equinor, professionally run meritocratic investing in research and development, Venezuelan petroleum engineers like Carlos are proud to work for PDVSA. They earn competitive salaries. They do cutting-edge technical work. Their expertise is valued, and in this alternative timeline, Chavez never implements economy-destroying price controls. Instead, if he wants to help poor people afford food, he implements targeted subsidies, direct cash transfers to poor families. Similar to Brazil's Bolsa Familia program, poor families receive electronic benefit cards that they can use to buy food at regular market prices. The government subsidizes their purchasing power rather than artificially lowering prices. Supermarkets set prices based on supply and demand, so shelves stay stocked with goods. There are no lines, no shortages, no rationing, farmers and food. Producers can profit at market prices, so they continue investing in production food supply. Increases. Rosa, the schoolteacher, benefits from these cash transfers in the 2000s. When inflation makes her salary tight, she receives a government supplement that helps her afford food, but the supermarkets are still stocked. And in this alternative timeline, Chavez never implements currency controls that create massive black markets and corruption. The Bolivar floats freely against the dollar, managed by the independent central bank. Yes, the Bolivar fluctuates and sometimes depreciates when oil prices fall, but it never becomes worthless. Like in the real timeline, because the economy remains productive, businesses that need to import equipment or raw materials can access foreign currency at market rates through banks. There's no need for black markets, no opportunity for corruption from arbitraging. Official versus black market rates. International trade continues. Normally, Venezuelan imports and exports flow freely, and critically in this alternative timeline, Chavez maintains democratic institutions. There are presidential term limits. Chavez serves 2 terms from 1999-2007 and steps down when his second term ends. Opposition media continues to operate freely, criticizing government policies, debating policy alternatives. The Supreme Court remains independent. checking executive power, elections remain competitive and transparent. The CNE Electoral Council is genuinely nonpartisan. In 2007, a center-left coalition wins the election, continuing some of Chavez's popular social programs. The Bolivarian missions health care for the poor, subsidized food assistance, but they also maintain the sovereign wealth fund. They keep working with the private sector. They don't nationalize everything. When oil prices crash in 2014, this new government faces the crisis with democratic legitimacy, with institutional checks and balances. They can make necessary adjustments. They cut some spending. They draw on the sovereign wealth fund. They implement reforms through dialogue and compromise with opposition. Parties and civil society. There's no dictatorship, no authoritarian crackdown, no jailing opposition leaders. And when we arrive at 2024 in this alternative timeline, Venezuela looks completely different from the real timeline. GDP per capita has grown from $4,500 in 1998 to approximately $12,000 in 2024, making Venezuela a prosperous upper-middle-income country comparable to Chile or Uruguay. Poverty rates have fallen from 49% in 1999 to approximately 12 under 15% in 2024 because of sustained economic growth plus targeted social programs. Actual reduction in poverty, not just consumption-based. Temporary reduction. The Venezuelan Sovereign Wealth Fund has over $600 billion in assets. One of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world, providing financial security for future generations. Oil production remains at 4 million barrels per day because PDVSA was kept professional, and well-managed. Venezuela is one of the top oil exporters globally. Unemployment is low because the private sector is vibrant and creating jobs in agriculture, in manufacturing, in services, in technology. Healthcare has improved dramatically because the government had sustained revenues to invest in hospital equipment, in medical supplies, and training doctors. Maria is a senior physician earning a good salary, $3,000, $4,000 monthly, treating patients with proper equipment and medications. Education has improved. Rosa retired comfortably in 2018 with a decent pension. Her students had textbooks and computers. Venezuelans aren't fleeing the country. In fact, Venezuela is still an immigration destination. In this timeline, people from Colombia, from other Latin American countries, from Europe come to Venezuela for opportunities. Carlos never lost his job. He's now a senior petroleum engineer at PDVSA, earning $5,000 monthly. His children attended university and have good jobs. Luis graduated from Universidad Central de Venezuela. With an engineering degree, he works for an international tech company in Caracas. And critically, this alternative Venezuela has become a model for other resource-rich countries, showing that you can have oil wealth and social democracy and strong institutions all at the same time. Scholars study the Venezuelan model, analyzing how the country avoided the resource curse, how it balanced redistribution with economic growth, and the painful, heartbreaking irony is that this alternative timeline was completely possible. Nothing in it required magic or supernatural intervention or incredible luck. It only required learning from countries that succeeded like Norway and Chile, and avoiding the mistakes of countries that failed like the Soviet Union. Hugo Chavez was elected democratically in 1998 with a legitimate mandate to help the poor, to reduce inequality, to make Venezuela's oil wealth benefit all Venezuelans, not just elites. Those goals were good. Those goals were achievable. He could have created a Venezuelan social democracy with universal healthcare funded by oil revenues, with good public schools, with a strong safety net, with targeted help for the poor, with infrastructure investment. He could have reduced poverty and inequality without destroying the economy. He could have empowered workers without nationalizing every business. He could have helped the poor without imposing price controls that created shortages. He could have saved oil wealth for future generations without abandoning social programs. But at every single decision point, Chavez chose ideology over pragmatism. He chose revolutionary socialism over social democracy. He chose confrontation over cooperation. He chose expropriation over taxation. He chose price controls over subsidies. He chose printing money over saving money. He chose political loyalty over technical competence. And Nicolas Maduro, who lacked even Chavez's political skills, then doubled down on every single one of these failures. And now in 2026, Venezuela is living with the consequences of those choices. 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled, creating families separated across continents, children who don't remember their parents, parents who died alone without seeing children again. Those who remain in Venezuela face grinding poverty, face hunger, face disease, face repression, face a government that denies elections, that jails opponents, that controls all institutions. An entire generation has grown up knowing only economic collapse. Young Venezuelans born in 2000, who are now 26 years old, have no memory of a functioning country. They've never known anything except shortages and inflation and dictatorship. And the alternative timeline where Venezuela chose wisely remains achingly visible in nearby countries. Colombia, despite decades of civil conflict, has a functioning democracy and a growing economy. Chile managed its copper wealth responsibly, created sovereign wealth funds, reduced poverty to under 8%, became the wealthiest country in South America. Even Ecuador, which has had populist governments which discovered oil in the 1970s like Venezuela, managed to avoid complete collapse. Venezuela had every advantage. It had more oil than Saudi Arabia. It had educated people. It had infrastructure. It had functioning institutions. It had a democratic tradition. It wasn't a poor country that failed to develop. It was a middle-income country that chose to destroy itself. The tragedy isn't that Venezuela was poor and stayed poor. The tragedy is that Venezuela was rich and chose poverty. The tragedy is that everything that happened was preventable, was avoidable, was a choice, and the people making those choices, the political leaders who implemented these policies, Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, and their inner circle, they're not the ones who suffered. Most of them enriched themselves through corruption. Hugo Chavez's daughter, Maria Gabriela Chavez, is reportedly worth $4.2 billion, according to some estimates. She lives in luxury. Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores and their family-controlled drug trafficking routes profit from food distribution monopolies, live in mansions with imported luxuries. The oligarchs, the Chavista elites who got rich from corruption, from accessing dollars at official rates, from controlling import licenses, from stealing from PDVSA, they're wealthy, they're fine, their children study abroad. The cost of socialist ideology was paid by ordinary people, by Maria the doctor who spent her life in medical school only to end up selling fruit on a street corner in Bogota, by Carlos the petroleum engineer who contributed a decade to building Venezuela's oil industry only to be fired and end up doing construction at age 56 in Peru, by Rosa the dedicated school teacher who worked for 25 years only to die alone from a preventable disease because diabetes medication wasn't available, by Luis the young man, whose potential was completely wasted, who never got to use his intelligence or contribute to society, who spends his life playing video games for a few dollars, by millions of families destroyed by refugees, sleeping in tents, by children separated from parents, by an entire country's potential thrown away. And that's the ultimate lesson of Venezuela. The lesson that every country should learn and remember. Ideology kills economies, pragmatism builds them. When politicians promise to defy economic laws, when they promise free everything, when they promise to take from the rich and give to the poor, through nationalization and confiscation rather than through taxation and investment, when they promise that their revolutionary vision will succeed, where every previous attempt has failed, you should run away as fast as possible, because Venezuela tried that, and Venezuela had every advantage, and Venezuela still failed, completely catastrophically destroyed itself in 27 years, and the millions of Venezuelan refugees scattered across the world are the evidence of that failure.